Ahora sí. Bueno, pues gracias a todas por venir, gracias también a quienes estéis conectados en el canal de YouTube del IVAM y sobre todo gracias a Silvia, muchas gracias Silvia, ha sido la verdad que duro poderte tenerte aquí, pero estamos muy contentas de por fin poder comentar y departir contigo en el marco de la exposición Industria. También muchas gracias a Lorenzo Sandoval y a Tono Vizcaíno. Como sabéis, esta charla se enmarca en el proyecto que podéis visitar en la planta baja, Industria, que luego nos contarán un poquito más los organizadores, y además en un seminario más amplio que continúa el día 15, que también nos van a contar un poco más cuál es el marco del seminario y por qué está Silvia aquí y quiénes son los otros invitados. Bueno, yo simplemente quería agradecer y además deciros que esta actividad, como decía, cierra el ciclo, pero también una colaboración sonora que será el día 15 en la Mutant, una serie de activaciones a partir de la máquina, la industria, la colectividad y los movimientos sociales a los que estáis invitados. Y sin más, porque lo interesante es compartir con Silvia, deciros que habrá una charla corta de ella, pero que luego podemos compartir y preguntar con ella a través del micrófono. Ella nos contestará lo que queramos y bueno, y que los organizadores están aquí un poco también para activar ese posible diálogo. Venga, gracias.
Buenas tardes a todos. Gracias por venir, por estar con nosotros y con Silvia. Agradecer mucho a Silvia que pueda participar en el seminario de Industria. Industria es un proyecto que empezamos casi hace 2 años, Tono Vizcaíno y yo, por invitación del IVAM, y en lo que consistía la invitación era pensar un archivo que después formara parte de la biblioteca del IVAM sobre el patrimonio industrial. Y nuestra posición respecto a este patrimonio industrial era intentar salir de una forma de percepción del patrimonio industrial que tiene que ver con la ruina, con una ruina que tiene un carácter en muchos casos romántico, y esa posición vinculada a lo romántico produce cierta distancia, ¿no? Produce un tipo de sacralización que nos parecía menos interesante, ¿no? Por lo que empezamos a trabajar en relación a pensar el patrimonio desde lo inmaterial y en vinculación también a lo sonoro, ¿no? Lo sonoro pensando con historias que normalmente no están escritas, con la oralidad, con la música, con el sonido de las propias máquinas, que normalmente nunca se suele registrar, con una serie de procesos que están muy cercanos pues, a elementos que tienen que ver con la socialización de muchos tipos, ¿no? Entonces, en ese sentido, pues una de las contribuciones que nos interesaba mucho era la de Silvia, ¿no? Que Tono va a introducir su trabajo ahora.
Bueno, hola, ¿se oye? Sí. Bueno, me sumo al agradecimiento de que estéis aquí en esta actividad presencial con Silvia Federici online. Como estaba comentando Loren, nosotros hemos intentado abordar la historia del trabajo y de los movimientos sociales vinculados al trabajo en el contexto fabril a través de distintas perspectivas, y había una cuestión que nos parecía que era fundamental y era entender que toda esta memoria industrial, ese patrimonio industrial, no se debe circunscribir a la fábrica exclusivamente, ¿no? Como el gran icono de lo industrial, sino que hay que salirse y pensar en esos otros espacios físicos y simbólicos que están vinculados a lo industrial, como puede ser el propio espacio público o como puede ser el espacio doméstico, que es lo que hoy, bueno, le vamos a prestar como más atención. Entonces, esta manera de pensar lo industrial nos permitía también visibilizar más el trabajo de las mujeres en relación con lo fabril, ¿no? Esto implica desde esa economía sumergida que muchas veces desarrollan las mujeres desde casa para la fábrica, también la transmisión de la propia cultura obrera en casa, ¿no? Por ejemplo, en el caso del puerto de Sagunto, que es uno de los casos que analizamos, toda esa organización de reivindicaciones, movimiento obrero y demás estuvo en manos de las mujeres, ¿no? Cuando todo el cierre de los altos hornos. Entonces también el espacio doméstico como un espacio de transmisión de todo todos esos valores. Y también un elemento clave que bueno, Silvia Federici nos hablará de eso, es de esa relación de lo productivo y lo reproductivo, ¿no? Al final, cómo desde la óptica capitalista el cuerpo de las mujeres se convierte en una máquina de producir nuevos trabajadores y nuevos consumidores. Entonces, de alguna manera, la comunicación de hoy va un poco en esa línea de poner en relación el trabajo productivo y el reproductivo en el contexto de la industria, ¿no? Del trabajo fabril. No sé si quieres añadir alguna cosa más, simplemente pues eso, decir que, como ya ha comentado Sonia, este es un primer día de este seminario, tendremos el día 15 la segunda parte del seminario con Amador, Fernández-Savater y con Bonaventure, Ndikung, que trataremos otras cuestiones relacionadas también con el espacio público, tomar la palabra, ¿no? La escucha y demás, que os invitamos a venir si os apetece, y ese concierto final que haremos en la Mutant ese mismo día.
Y bueno, simplemente, como decía Sonia antes, también recogeremos preguntas aquí en directo para Silvia, y aquellos que estén viéndolo desde casa pues también pueden ir escribiendo en el chat, que iremos mirando estas preguntas y luego lanzándolas. And I think like people at home, they can't hear the English translation now, so for those at home, like if you want to make some questions to Silvia, please write them down in the chat and we translate her these questions.
Bueno, creo que es Silvia Federici es conocida por todas vosotras seguro, pero simplemente por contextualizar, Silvia Federici se ha convertido en una de las teóricas más reconocidas del feminismo anticapitalista. Con una larga trayectoria de activismo y reflexión, la vida de Federici recorre los agitados años de la revuelta en Italia, las campañas por el salario doméstico en Nueva York, la lucha contra los planes de ajuste estructural en África, la crítica al proceso de globalización capitalista y sus efectos en todo el planeta, el movimiento por la recuperación de los comunes y, más recientemente, el ciclo de luchas que se abrió en 2011 y que ha continuado en la última ola feminista. Traficantes de Sueños ha publicado ya buena parte de su obra en castellano. Calibán y la bruja, Revolución en punto cero, El patriarcado del salario, Reencantar el mundo, el feminismo y la política de los comunes y Salario para el trabajo doméstico, el archivo de la campaña internacional. Entonces, sin más, le damos la palabra a Silvia Federici y agradecemos de nuevo su presencia en este seminario.
Muchas gracias a usted. Muchas gracias. Bueno, so I'm going to speak English and I'll try to speak slow so to facilitate the translation. And greetings to everybody. Those in the room, and it's a pity not to be with you, and those who are listening from their homes. And thank you so much for inviting me to speak of this concept, of this topic, which is as important today as it was, in the 70s when we began to, in the context of the feminist movement, to approach the question of the body. It was the feminist movement, in fact, that took the body as a key political category, speaking, in fact, of body politics. This was part of a process of expanding our understanding of what has been capitalist exploitation and seeing the capital exploitation, contrary to what the socialist, Marxist tradition always told us, does not take place only in the factories and only in the context of wage labor, but actually continued in our kitchen, in our community, in our life as women. And that, in fact, women had been, through the history of capitalism into the present, have been subjected to forms of exploitation even more invasive than what the factory workers had been subjected to, in the way that capitalism had appropriated our body, our sexuality, our emotional life, and reorganize our work, reorganize, our existence in function of the reproduction of labor power. So this is what I'm going to speak about today, and I want to touch on a concept that, will come back at the end of my presentation, which is, I think is very, very important today when we speak of the body, at a time when so much attention is now on focusing on this question, right? We speak of remaking our body. We speak of new conception of what gender, of the role of gender in our social and individual life. I think it's very important in this context, to never lose sight, of the social, economic processes and the forces, the social economic forces that in fact have been shaping the body of women and men throughout the history of capitalism. And at the same time, also the struggles that have responded, to this, an impact that capitalism has had on our bodies. So, in the Caribbean and the Witch, I began a whole process of analysis that attempted to understand, why, what have been the specific ways, the specific forms, in which capitalism has impacted women's life, and began to realize, in fact, that the development of capitalist society, the development of capitalist relation has had very different, exits, for women and men. And for example, it was, and it is impossible, to speak of a history of the body or a history of exploitation, because in fact, there are different histories, to the extent that from the very beginning of capitalist development, one of the main tasks that capitalism has taken on has been the production of differences, the production of inequality, of different regimes of labor, different regimes of exploitation. And to the extent that those differences have also created, new different policies, towards our bodies, towards the organization of our daily work, and you can write a history of the slave body and the history of the slave body, of the female slave body, the history of the male slave body, a history of the factory worker, and the history of the houseworker, the history of the housewife. So we began to, myself as well as other women, that, for example, we were reading in the 1980s, everybody was very enthralled by the work of Michel Foucault, right? Who basically also, I think, influenced by the women's movement, had begun to look at the question of the body, right? But we began to see that, in fact, in Foucault's work, you have an approach that, in a sense, mystifies, the forms of disciplining the bodies have been subjected to the extent that they are not rooted, in processes of capitalist organization of work. And to the extent they speak of one body, they speak of one form of corporality, whereas in our analysis, in my analysis, doing historical work and the analysis that the women's movement was in fact producing in the process of reappropriating women's history and trying to understand what are the specific forms of exploitation that women have suffered in capitalism. We're beginning to understand, in fact, that the profound diversification of ways in which people have entered capitalist society, and realizing at the same time that these differences were rooted in different regimes of labor, in different labor regimes. in different forms of exploitation, as well as in the interest that capitalism always had to keep people separate, to create a situation in which it appears that the same exploited have different interests, different or even conflicting interests. And in particular, I think it's been very important to see that the analysis, the traditional analysis that I was referring to before of Marx and the anarchist and socialist thinker have given us, right, of a capitalism that is interested in labor in general, and the worker speaks of the worker, and in particular the wage worker, but concentrates the class struggle and concentrate the crucial territory for the accumulation of capital in the factory and in wage labor, that this analysis was untenable. Because it left out the whole area of activities, that whole universe of activities that are necessary, for the production of the worker, that are necessary, in fact, to reproduce people's capacity to work, on a day-to-day basis, on a generational basis, and that in fact the capitalist organization of work is much broader, than the territory of the factory and the relations connected to it. That in fact the capitalist organization of work, if we could conceive it as a large assembly line, is an assembly line that runs through the communities, and in a way, has the community as its very strategic center, because the home, the house, the community, is a place where the labor power, the capacity to work, the labor force is produced, right? So that when we speak of a history of industry, when we speak of a history of industrial work, of the factory system, we cannot leave out this whole other area, which is the area of domestic work and many other reproductive activities, sexual work in the home, as well as in sex work, in prostitution, procreation, child raising, right? That all these activities are in fact activities that can be considered as forms of production, forms of capitalist production, at the same title the factory work is. Because without the worker itself, without the reproduction of the energy that are necessary to sustain a day of work and a life of work, right? No work activity would be possible. So we began very early to actually turn the tables, right, to reverse the traditional conception of what capitalist development, capitalist accumulation requires, what it is, what it requires, what is based upon, and began to see that in fact, this area of life and this social subject, the houseworker, the housewife, that in the Marxist tradition had always been marginalized, made invisible, and so forth, or even looked at as a backward subject, as a backward, non-political subject, that in fact played a major role, in the production of the labor force, which is not a natural given. It's not something that is naturally available. It is consumed every day in the labor process and has to be continuously reproduced. And that this reproduction, is an important, crucial historical process, social historical process, that is indispensable to understand the history of women in capitalist society. No matter, where women have been, even the history of slavery is a history which is different for men and women. For example, we know that in several states, in the plantation economy of the United States, in particular in states like Virginia, the masters, the owners of the plantation, right, tried and in fact developed a whole breeding industry that in their mind, in their hopes, would reduce the cost of importing slaves from Africa. And so it was the idea of a domestic production of slaves. And that domestic production of slaves meant that, enslaved women were subjected to some of the most brutal forms, mass rape and enforced procreation. And of course, the worst of that once they would have their children, those children would be taken away from them and auctioned as new slaves, right? So it became very clear to us there was this very important, I would say almost umbilical connection, women reproductive work and capitalist accumulation, the capitalist organization of work. And we could not talk about one without at the same time, talking about the other. This is the perspective that I mentioned before I brought to Caliban and the Witch, in which I tried to understand the different moments, the different historical moments of this construction. And in that process, I in fact began to rethink, reanalyze, the phenomena like the Great European Witch Hunt, and reinterpret it from the point of view of the discipline of women, right? To turn them into housewives, into houseworkers, into social subject destined to be the servant, of the wage working force. And of course, the witch hunt, had multiple motivation behind it, but at the same time, a fundamental one, was the attempt of the states to take control of the body of women and, for example, demonized as they are still doing today, demonize any form of contraception, any form of abortion, right, which was, labeled, branded, as, the expression of a demonic disposition. And in fact, many women who were burned at the stake as witches were women, in fact, accused of killing children, accused of contraceptive practices. Many were healers, many were midwives, and so the issue of procreation, was a very important issue in the witch hunt. And to see that became possible precisely because of all the analysis that the feminist movement had done, trying to understand why has capitalism, right, been so insistent, in the denial of abortion? Why procreation is being so controlled by the state, and it still is to this day. In fact, I'm going to come to it in a few minutes. Why it is being so controlled by the state. And we realized that, in fact, for capitalism, and the whole area of procreation and the women's body, the uterus, right, are seen, are inserted, in an economic context. Procreation, is a dimension of the labor market, right? And procreation is not just the procreation of children in your life. Procreation is involved in the creation of a labor force, right? For example, a massive collapse in the birth rate today or in the past would be a disaster for a capitalist society who has always needed a surplus population, has always needed not only an abundant amount of workers for the factories and the offices and the school, but has also needed also a surplus population, as an element of discipline of the labor force, right? And so certainly, the perspective that the feminist movement have developed, right, on housework, reproduction as moment of capitalist production, was very important to also rethink the history of capitalism, to see that actually Marx recognized that, the accumulation of capital is the accumulation of a workforce. What Marx did not see is that accumulation of the workforce implied particular form of exploitation and particular form of control on the woman's body, on the uterus, on the womb, right? Now seen basically as a factory of worker, right? Now, with time, I could say many more things because I want to make clear briefly that obviously the male bodies too have been exploited. Obviously, there's a whole exploitation that takes place, also in the history of wage labor. Nobody becomes a wage worker without undergoing a great process of disciplining. I wrote in Caliban of the Wage that one of the main tasks of capitalist society, particularly in the first phase of its development, but continuing through its history into the present, and of course the educational system is very involved in that, right, has been the transformation of the human body into a work machine. What does it mean to transform the human body into a work machine? It means to create a situation in which we are prone to act as automaton, in which, yes, we have to have a certain initiative and creativity, but within certain limit, within proper limit, within limits that are productive. And that, in fact, capitalism through its history has, in fact, reshaped, reconstructed, our body in its relationship with the natural world, in its relationship to other people, through the whip, through execution, through jailing, as well as through, the promotion of certain capacity instead of others. So there's a whole history that would be really interesting and important to talk, and part of it I have written in some of my work, but it's an analysis that has to continue into the present. But what I wanted to stress here, particularly in relation to the connection between the home, the community, the factory, and in particular relation to what has been called as women's labor, which more appropriately I would call the labor of reproducing the workforce, that in fact we have to see that obviously capitalism does not have one approach only, right? For instance, in the case of procreation, what we have seen more and more, in recent time, especially in the 90s and through the last decades, in response, and this is my theory, of course, in response, to the surge of anti-colonial struggles, that have taken place across the world, and they have peaked in the 60s and part of the 70s, right? We have seen an increasing preoccupation, right, with the so-called population explosion, in countries, regions like Africa, parts of Asia, Latin America, and consequently broad-based attempt, to regulate, the natality of the population involved, and with very, very perverse, means, imposition of, contraceptives that women cannot control, and sterilization, massive forms of initiative by local medical authorities, as well other authorities imported, engaging in massive forms of sterilization of women, etc. I say this to stress that clearly what is important to the capitalist state into the present, right, is at the same time very differentiated. Is the control over the body, is the control over the processes by which a labor force is produced, which means that under certain circumstances, the same state will impose sterilization, while under others, they will, criminalize abortion. This is what we are seeing and have seen now for the last few decades, that these two policies have continuously coexisted in different places, addressed to different populations. They are not in contradiction. They indicate that the issue is really the capacity of the state, national and international, to control the production of the labor force at its earliest form, in its most primordial force, which is the production of children, which is the process of procreation. And I insist on that because what we are seeing now in the United States is in fact a new massive, campaign to eliminate abortion. In fact, if you read, if you listen to some of the news that are coming from the United States, this is one of the major issues now, on the table at the present. On Saturday, there's going to be a huge demonstration in New York. There will be probably more than 100,000 women. And there will be demonstration in other parts of the countries because of a legislation that has been passed in Texas that is unbelievable. And I want to talk about it because I want people to know what kind of things are possible, even in a country that now presents itself as enlightened, with respect to women. The legislation says that any person can now accuse any other person that in any way is involved in facilitating, helping, and conducting the abortion, a woman's abortion. So, for example, anybody in the Texan community can accuse a taxi driver that has brought a woman to an abortion clinic, and that taxi driver will risk many years of jail, will be considered an accomplice to manslaughter, and the accuser will be given $10,000. Will be given $10,000. This is an unbelievable attack. And this applies, the ban on abortion applies for women who have been raped, for women who have, there's no limitation as to, how a woman is forced to procreate regardless of the conditions of her life. At the same time, we have seen a process that has been described many times as the criminalization of pregnancy. The criminalization of pregnancy is a set of fetal protection laws, which make pregnancies very dangerous for a woman, which create a situation where becoming pregnant becomes very dangerous for a woman. Because once you have a fetal protection laws, if you drink too much wine, and then by a coincidence, you also happen to abort, you can be accused of manslaughter. Women have already been arrested. They found themselves in a car accident while pregnant. They were arrested because of reckless behavior, etc., etc. These norms are presented as norms dictated by the need to protect life. In reality, they are ways because they affect mostly poor women, women who depend on public services. They are really, in the end, meant to discourage them from becoming pregnant. What is all of this? What is all of this and what it all means? It means that, again, the state has an interest in controlling the uterus, in controlling the body of women, which in some cases may dictate preventing women from having children if they are seen as troublemakers, or if they are seen as workers who may eventually depend on the state or may not be very productive, right? And at the same time, force women to procreate against their will, right? For those children who are seen to be destined to be productive workers and possibly, law-abiding citizens and so forth. And I think we have to look at this from this perspective, at the transformation that are taking place, in the reorganization of reproduction, whether it is the organization of housework, the organization of procreation and sexuality. And realize that, of course, capitalism today does not follow the same norms of 16th century, 17th century capitalism, right? The capitalism that burned the witches, and nevertheless, although witch burning is continuing in many regions of the world, and that's a whole discussion. But at the same time, the crucial strategic importance of reproduction in all its forms, in all its different aspects, right, is constantly recognized and at the center of social policy. And I think it's very important for us in the movement to acknowledge that. Because today there's a great interest about the bodies, identities, how transforming our bodies is crucial, to expand the range of our possibilities. And all of this is very well. Unfortunately, all too often there is a tendency to separate our understanding of how our bodies, shape our social identities and what are the key struggles in which we need to engage, to separate them from the issue of the organization of labor, from the issue of organization. An example, can we talk about the binary unless we talk about the sexual division of labor, or the racial division of labor, right? In other words, we cannot. The point that I'm trying to drive, 2 points that I'm trying to drive in this presentation, 2 points. First of all, the need to see that the organization of capitalist accumulation and the organization of exploitation is much broader than what revolutionary thinking has prepared us to see. And that in fact, more and more, we are beginning to appreciate the fact, that perhaps, and I would say yes, the question of reproduction is the most fundamental. Over years, reproduction, I think for myself and many other feminists, has expanded in its meaning. We now see Whereas in the 1970s, reproduction for us meant procreation, sexuality, housework, domestic work, affective labor. Now we'll see, of course, the environment, subsistence farming, right? The whole relationship with nature, healing, healthcare, all of these are important. All of these are crucial, and have to be changed. In fact, the body is at the center of all social movement. There's hardly a social movement that, in a way, in its struggles don't have an impact on our body. Food, air, water, agriculture, etc. So this is one point. What is productive and what is non-productive? What is productive from a capitalist viewpoint and what is called reproductive? Actually, the productivity of housework is, in a way, is as much, if not higher, than the productivity of other forms of wage labor. Because again, without the worker, without our capacity to work, we don't have a labor force. Second, our struggle. When we think of how capitalism has shaped our body, we also have to see that it's not been a one-way street. No, it has not been a one-way street. Obviously, the way our bodies are today, are the product of an immense struggle. They are the product of an immense struggle. Often I walk into the street and I look at the women walk today and I say, my God, I feel strong, I feel good, because I feel that in their walk, so much struggle has gone to produce the sense of strength, the sense of the refusal to efface yourself, the refuse to be invisible. That was typical of many women, for such a long time, and the kind of submission, of submissiveness, the capitalism has imposed on women, right? And the women have refused. Now it appears in our bodies. Now it appears in the way we walk, in the way we relate to each other, etc. So I think we cannot think only about capitalism as all determining and all powerful. It is not. So what we are today, it's also a product of many, many struggles, right? And, I was thinking when, I think it was Lorenzo perhaps, or one in the introduction, talking about the ruins of the industrial world, the building, what we see, what the industrial world has left today, right? The empty building. You go to Detroit and you see really the ruin. You see kilometers of factories empty, where once you had thousands and thousands of workers, now completely empty, right? Why? Because those jobs, those activities have gone across the world, often on a sweatshop basis, in many maquilas, where young women are losing their lives. But I was thinking, the impact of the industrial work, what remains of the industrial work, is also in our bodies. Our bodies have been forged by years and years and years of disciplining. Nobody is born a capitalist worker. It takes a long, long disciplining in order to produce the kind of worker, in particular the kind of worker who can stay all day at the computer. All day at the computer. Imagine, what does it take to create that kind of worker? At the same time, our body have sedimented also a whole history of struggle. A whole history of struggle. So we need to look at our body, right? History is not read only in the books, right? There's a whole oral history, and there's also a history that is perpetuated through the song, is perpetuated through the poetry, is perpetuated through the gestures of everyday life, and is also perpetuated and can be read if we train our eyes, right? It can be read through our bodies, looking at our bodies, how they're being shaped, how they've changed. I think that this is very important. But to conclude and making my last point, you know, I want to conclude here because I want to hear the questions. It's very important that we also see that fundamentally we cannot concentrate, right? We can, first of all, we cannot think that, you know, certain being men, women, and so on are only issues of performance. But there are issues of the organization of work. We cannot separate, right, the way people have acted, you know, from the range of forces that were shaping their life, or economic exploitative forces that were shaping their life, right? And secondly, that we can change the world not only by changing our bodies, right? And not also changing, you know, the vast world of economic and social relations, right? That have sustained certain forms of exploitation, and that this is part of our struggle. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Silvia. Thank you very much for this very inspiring talk. Muchas gracias, Silvia, por esta charla que nos da tantas herramientas de trabajo. Bueno, quería ver si en la sala hay alguna pregunta. Vale. Y si hay alguien online, escucharía esto en 30 segundos. If there is someone online listening, like please, you can put some questions in the chat. Y también se puede hacer en castellano y se traduce también. Well, if there is no questions, I would like to make a question, Silvia.
Sí.
Is it okay in Spanish?
Sí, sí.
Sí, vale.
Sí.
Quería preguntar, en un contexto en el que también las condiciones de producción están variando, yo diría que en todo el mundo, ¿no? O sea, cuando hay unos procesos que tienen que ver con un gobierno que va a ser algorítmico y una serie de procesos de automatización, también cómo podemos empezar a repensar las relaciones entre reproducción y automatización en un mundo donde lo digital y lo algorítmico está cada vez más presente.
Sí. Okay. Bueno, well, I can reply. You know, to me, the fundamental, you know, the issue of automatization is very important. But I also, I'm struggling to say that we should not be blackmailed by the constant reminding that the world is being automized and workers are being made useless. And in fact, this is not what is taking place. What is taking place is that the area of wage labor has been reduced. And definitely, there's been a shrinking of the areas of wage labor, at least relatively speaking. You know, people who are dispossessed, there's an immense amount of dispossession taking place today as in the past. And this is why we speak of a new forms of primitive accumulation. You know, we are brought back to the processes, you know, that took place in the early part of capitalist development, when the peasantry through Europe and in the so-called New World was thrown off the land. This is happening. The expulsion And privatization, commercialization of land is creating massive, massive migration processes. But I think it would be a mistake to interpret them as to the fact that labor is not any longer necessary. Wage labor has been reduced, but in fact, labor more than ever, right? It's informal, it's unpaid. The area of unpaid, informal labor has immensely increased. And this is why it is invisibilized. And this is why the struggle of women to make visible unpaid labor, to show that this unpaid labor that is going on in the work of reproduction, that is in fact so-called productive labor in the capitalist Marxian sense, right? So I would say that, yes, the digitalization of work has created a new discipline of the body. I was talking before, I mean, my God, what is happening, for example, right, with the new generation of children who are learning from a very early age, right, to be glued to a computer, to speak to a computer, study through a computer, rather than, for example, this is what is happening in the United States. There is the idea of giving every child in every school a little computer because presumably this facilitates their learning. This is one aspect. Yeah, this is a whole training of future workers who are going to be desocialized, who are going to have a life increasingly isolated from others, more and more individualized. This is the project, and this is the project we have to fight against. Because that process of isolation, not to mention what it does to our body, what it does to our neuron, what it does to the quality of our life, right? And that is a very, how the immense social wealth, the relation with other people provide, is being taken away from us. We are being taught to fear other people, right? Rather than in fact, and this has very specific reason. The individualization of work, individualization of life has been a long-term, long-seated capitalist project. Isolated from each other, we are easily defeated. Imagine, individual labor contract. What power do you have in an individual labor contract? Individual where you don't know the condition of work of other workers. You don't have the trust, you don't have the affection, you don't have the social relation of the coming together. So this is something, two things to fight against. The idea that we are useless, that now computers will do anything, this is a lie. Actually, it can be shown that people are working today more than ever. The difference in much of their work is not recognized as work. Much of the work is invisible. Take students. When I grew up, some of us were fighting for wages for students. We saw that the students were unpaid workers. But today, not only you have to do the work of studying, and not only in many places, you have to pay to study. In the United States, you have to pay thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars. But you have to do many hours of unpaid labor to professionalize yourself. You have to now do at all level of specialization. Specialization means sometimes 1 year of unpaid labor. There's now a very important struggle going on. It has been for a number of years in Canada, right? But this is an example of how work has increased. Actually, student labor has multiplied because not only you have the work of studying, then you have the work of getting the money because it costs more and more to study. So you have to do some more work to study. And then you have to do the work for the specialization, which means they put you in a firm or they put you in a hospital and you do unpaid labor. And we have learned that in the United States, in some cases, the company lays off the workers they have because now they have a steady flow of unpaid students. So that we have to refuse the idea it's labor that creates capitalist value. Machines do not create value. Marx was right. I'm very critical of Marx on many points, but Marx was right here. Machines do not create value. This is the truth of the industrial era and post. And secondly, the isolation of the worker. This process. So for some people might be happy. Oh, I'm working from home. I don't have to pay for the transport, etc., etc. In reality, that isolation, capitalism has isolated us from nature, from animals, from each other. Has created a relation in which we are so much more easily controlled, dominated, because the process of individualization is not a process of strengthening, it's a weakening. When you are alone, you cannot think. The range of possibilities that you think of are very limited. You cannot think of doing anything when you are alone, of changing the system. You have to be to other people to even conceptualize any idea of social change. If you are in a demonstration with 10,000 people, your brain expands, your energies expand. This is an experience we have all had. So I think that these two issues are very fundamental.
Thanks a lot. That was like a really good answer. No sé si hay una cuestión. Si vais a preguntar, por favor, siempre pedid el micrófono, porque así la gente que está online, gracias por pedirlo, que está online también nos puede escuchar y además grabamos las preguntas.
¿Se escucha? Sí. Perdona, no sé si hablo en español o en inglés, pero ¿sí que puedo hablar en español? Oh, bueno.
Doesn't matter.
No,
Puede hablar como quieres.
Oh, sorry, because I'm Brazilian, but I wrote it anyway. No, it's like, how do we draw the line between the true empowerment and the capitalist speech? Because I think right now the youth cannot differentiate. And I don't know, are things getting worse? Thank you very much.
Well, I think we can draw the line, for example, in terms of what empowerment is collective or it's individual, right? In other words, I think our struggle is to, create conditions of struggle that are aiming of transforming, the life of the collectivity, not the life of us as individual. Individually, yes, individual can always, not always, on the contrary, but some individual can always make it, right? But I think that's the, and now when we think of the collectivity, we also have to think of the collectivity beyond our national borders, because with the globalization of economic life, more and more we find the companies, I know it's true in the United States, it's true in Canada, you go to Mexico, you go to Ecuador, to El Salvador, and you find that people are struggling, because the companies, they are poisoning their waters. Gold mining, oil drilling are companies that are coming from the US, from Canada, from the European Union, etc. So we need to be aware also of those developments. And in our movement also make those connections. Right? But that to me is the dividing line. In other words, what gives us power to change and eliminate, the forms of exploitation, and not only in terms of individual achievement, but in terms of actually broad social structural changes.
Good evening, Silvia. I would like to thank you for your talk. And also you mentioned before environmental issues, and I wanted to ask you, how do you think they intersect the notion of control of reproduction? Because often we are told that the problem of the climate crisis, for example, depends on population, on overpopulation, and there is also like an argument for controlling birth and women's rights. So, whereas we know that it's a systemic problem, it cannot be reduced to individual behavior. So I wondered if you could expand a little bit on that. Thank you.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Women are not responsible, for the consumption of carbon, for the consumption of electricity, for the consumption, for the pollution, deforestation, what is burning our forests. Just take the forest, right? The forests are disappearing. The forests are disappearing. For instance, and this is not happening only now with the fires. The cutting, massive cutting of the equatorial forest began in the 1980s and 90s with the process of structural adjustment, with the creation, the artificial creation of the debt crisis, right? And the World Bank and the IMF began to force government in Africa to open their door to companies that were logging, were destroying the forest in order to pay back the debt, a debt which had been artificially created to the raise of the interest on the dollar by the American federal government. So, by the American Federal Reserve. So, to pay back the debt, they had to open their door to mining company, logging company which destroyed the equatorial forest, etc., etc. In Brazil, in Paraguay, El Chaco, the Amazonia are burning. And today the Amazonia is producing, instead of taking in carbon monoxide, is producing it. Why? To make space for cattle and selling to the European Union meat, etc. All these are commercial interests. There's nothing to do with overpopulation. I've done a lot of work on this in the 90s. And what became very clear was that people are having more children because they are poor. They are not poor because they are having children. They are having children because they are poor. Because if you are poor, if you don't have social security, if you don't have anything, first of all, you need 4 or 5 children to send to the road to earn a little money. There is a report now. It came out 2 days ago. I think it's the United Nations or some organization. And the report says there's more than 1 million children, slave. Slave means they were sold into slavery for many years. In Ghana, in Zambia, in many parts of, particularly in Africa. The parents are selling their children because they are very poor and they need, this way they get some money. Even if they don't sell them, you need a child that goes on the road to selling some peanuts. You need a girl who helps to take care of the kids when the mother goes out to do a certain job. Children are your social security for the future. If you have an accident and you don't have, so conclusion, the massive impoverishment, the lack of social provision, all of which are a direct consequence of the policy of international agencies, the World Bank, the IMF, which means United States, the European Union. They are all responsible for this massive impoverishment, which then produces the need for more children, making it possible for the family to survive. or giving the hope of some survival, right? So it's a big lie, and it's not accidental, because the blaming of the victim is always the capitalist policy.
Hello, Silvia. Thank you very much for your presentation. It was really interesting. I have actually two questions. The second one just appeared, so I'm going to say both. And, the first one is about the domestic space. So as you said, the social reproduction and labor reproduction happens mainly in the domestic space. And woman has somehow its own space in the kitchen, or the spatial configuration, it's very clear. And I wanted to ask you if you think in emerging forms of housing, such as collective housing or co-housing forms that are appearing now, especially after the crisis, also in Spain, if there is a transformative force in changing the power structures within those. And the second question that appeared now is, how do you think the femicides are connected with the conditions of the poor conditions of a country, how and the capitalism connected with the difficulties for many families, how this connects with the femicides that are growing in certain countries, for example, in Greece. Now there is a great issue these days. Thank you very much.
Yeah. So yeah, absolutely. I think the collective cooperative housing, it's a way to the future. Commoning, I've always spoken about commoning reproduction. And I think the breaking down also, no, this very individualized. There's a lot to talk about, but for instance, coming from the United States, there's been such an amazing effort. The creation of suburbia, the little houses, all separate from each other, and all placed far away from the place of wage work. So when a man stops working, he goes miles and miles away from where he can meet with other workers, right? And then the little houses and the women, really prisoners of, yeah. So I think that now people are coming together. Older people are coming together. They don't have money for an apartment, younger people, etc. But I think that that impulse to create new forms of family, the extended family, is so important. And it's so necessary, you know, very necessary. Imagine when you have in the family a person who is not self-sufficient. So many women now, you know, are prisoners of this situation. Imagine when there was the extended family where different people could take care of each other, you know, and yeah, that's definitely. So this is one of the things we need to struggle for, to make it possible, and make it possible in a way that does not create conflict. Because if we come together in situation of no money, no space, no flexibility, then of course a lot of the conflict emerge, right? So we don't want trouble in the commons, you know, commons without trouble. And the trouble means that we need to bring more resources. We need to create new forms of reproduction and also reclaim new wealth for it. New wealth for it. Feminicide, absolutely. Absolutely. We have to see, first of all, that a lot of killings, you know, are really institutionally motivated, you know, and for example, all throughout Latin America and so on, women are being killed, you know, because they are in the front line. They are being killed by paramilitary, by the police, by paramilitary, because they are fighting against deforestation, fighting against land expropriation, etc. But there is also all this domestic fighting, and I mean domestic, not only in the nuclear family, but also among partner, Men are now, responding to women's struggle for more autonomy. Also, the tension of a life that has no security, that is very precarious, is now being used against women. Men are also turning on women, right? All the frustration, of the precarization of their life. Many see their women now as competitors because they are fighting to have some autonomy. So all these factors. I've done some work now recently on the question of debt. So many families now are full of debt because the wages are terrible. Life is very precarious. So debt, you get the credit card and you are basically accumulating. And we have seen that when women, the more debt they have, the more they are vulnerable, to violence. So definitely there's a direct connection between the economic condition and the violence of this economic condition. We need to see the violence is not only, done with a gun. We have to see the violence is something broader than killing with a gun or with a knife. We have to see the violence is also inscribed in many economic policies. Economic policies that are depriving of people's means of reproduction are violence. I think we need to make that. And we need to say that a lot of the violence that is exercised by individual men is also made possible by the broader institutional violence. There is a feminist, very important, a feminist activist, sociologist in France, Jules Falquet. She has written very important analysis of women, globalization, feminicide, etc. And she has also pointed out that the increase of violence against women in Europe, for instance, is directly related also, to the militarization of life. Militarization means everywhere there are security guards, everywhere there are men who are employed to exercise violence, protect the bank, protect this, protect that, more people in the army, constant warfare, more people building jails. So the armed man, the man who is resolving conflict, whose daily job is in fact to exercise violence, right, brings home that violence, Fanon was right, when he was talking about the situation, of the French in Algeria, the people who were torturing the Algerian activists, the Algerian militants, they will go home and then being violent against their wives, and violence is indivisible. So when Falquet pointing out that now, think of the movies. Who is the hero? It's always the man with 15 guns. It's the monster, the destructive power. Everywhere there is a glorification, a celebration of the most hyper-masculinity. Hyper-masculinity intended as the capacity to kill, the capacity to destroy. And I think the women have not done enough to put an end to this. They've not done enough. And I think we are to blame for not having done enough to end it.
Sí, si hay alguna cuestión online, ¿no? O si hay alguna cuestión más en la sala. Yo quería lanzar I would like to ask one more question. Like before, like in the talk you made a differentiation between the capitalist mode of production and production. And I think like together with the struggle, it's also important to imagine which kind of possible models we can develop for a better future to come.
Yeah.
And yeah, I would like to ask you if maybe you can give us like some examples through your research, like of some models of production, like that are bringing some hope also.
Yeah, I think there are people are, for example, creating new commons. There is a big struggle going on, across the world for preventing the destruction of existing commons, but also for the creation of new commons. I think that much attention for a number of years, was given, particularly by Italian autonomists and others, to the creation of digital commons, right? The internet as a way of creating, and there was a lot of enthusiasm, think of Negri's work, Empire, and so on. But I think that much more importantly, there is a drive in many parts of the world, mostly propelled by the crisis, by the fact that there are areas of the world where people have no alternative but to come together and to begin to put their energy together and take over land, take over and organize it communally. One classic example, of course, is the Zapatistas. They're having a very, very difficult time. They are surrounded by the army, etc. The Zapatista is one example, but it's not alone. The landless movement of Brazil. They have recuperated thousands and thousands and hundreds of thousands of hectares of land. They are producing on their land. They are distributing in the cities, at least 8 cities. I've been in Brazil and I've seen this process, the product of what they produce in a non-commercial way, and so everywhere there is a struggle, for instance, for land recuperation and for creating. And I have to say, the women are very crucial in this struggle, because I think that their involvement in the question of reproduction, it's nothing to do with being physiologically superior. It's to do with the fact that you have to deal with children, you have to deal with disease, you have to use the water, you have to put some food on the table that is not killing people. And so the whole involvement, in the question of the land, the air, the water, and I've been writing in Enchanting the World. To me, this is what gives me hope about the possibility of creating another world.
So I think if there is no more questions, I think that would be a very beautiful way of finishing our encounter today. I would like to thank you again for your generosity, because we know you are quite busy, for being here. And thanks a lot. And we hope we meet soon in person.
Yes, thanks to you all, and a big un gran abrazo, un gran placer estar con vosotras, y espero de encontrarle pronto también. Sí.
Muchas gracias.
Vemos. Sí.